I
Oh,
mean,
nice. We got
That
it.
doesn't mean it's not
I think so.
Yeah.
Just
We
leave
got
it
it.
like that.
Okay. You are screen sharing. Present to everyone? No.
No, just
Don't touch it.
Okay.
Don't take it out. All right. Nice. Awesome.
very good.
Yes.
We're very high tech.
Yeah, very good.
I know.
All right. Hello, everybody. So today we'll continue the basic neuroscience with auditory physiology. Last year, only 1 year ago, we had a very, very detailed discussion of the neuroanatomy, both of the ear and of the auditory pathways. So I'm going to try to avoid redoing that and focus instead on the physiology itself. You need some anatomy, and both by way of review and introduction, if necessary, we'll do a little bit of anatomy as well. We, however, are going to focus, as you can see in this outline, on the physiology. So sound, just starting with physics. Sound is produced from vibrations. The vibrations can be created by strings, sheets, vocal cords, whatever you want. All right, thank you. And as a result of these vibrations, though, what you actually do is set up this alternating compression and rarefaction of the surrounding air. Totally different, say, than a photon, which has its own oscillation, but is traveling through a vacuum or medium or anything else. There's not going to be any sound in a vacuum, right? If you can't produce this compression and rarefaction in air, then you're not going to have any sound. Sound radiates outward as a sphere and reflects very well, and so it can be shaped, as you know from a concert hall, for instance. There's some basic stuff that you probably know. The frequency of peak to peak, or number of peaks per time, is the pitch, okay? The frequency, the pitch. The maximum change in the air pressure will determine the amplitude of the wave. Here's our good friend, the tuning fork. It's issuing sounds. These are going to be concentric waves that radiate outward from the tuning in all 360 degrees three-dimensionally. Here might be you put a sensor anywhere that you want within the system, and you see the compression and rarefaction of the air in a sinusoidal pattern, assuming the original sound was sinusoidal. And that's the way it goes. I like this diagram as a sort of summary, because you get to the sense of which things are, again, you have frequency. Frequency is measured in hertz, which is cycles per second, or kilohertz, whatever you want. You have amplitude, which I'm going to explain. The decibel rating is a very nonlinear logarithmic scale that I'll show you. It's quite complicated. The waveform, you can look, is it a true sinusoid, or is it, is it asymmetric? Is the wave itself asymmetric? And what's the phase? Now, phase is important because you can have the same, if you had two detectors, all right, and you had the same sound wave being produced by a tuning fork, they're going to see the same amplitude, they're going to see the same frequency, but one's going to come before the other. And so their phase, the relationship of those sinusoids one to the other, are going to be different from one another. That phase is going to be one of the ways that we localize positions in space. We have two ears. So we have stereoscopic hearing, if you will, binaural hearing. We're going to use the difference for certain frequencies. We're going to use the distance between our ears as a way of making a phase detection. So we'll come to all that. The human ear is sensitive all the way from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. If you think the retina is sensitive, because it can detect a single photon, the amount of energy in a photon is about 6 orders of magnitude more than the energy of our minimum hearing. Okay, hearing is unbelievably sensitive. It's unbelievably sensitive. As we said, loudness is related to the amplitude and is measured in decibels. And here's a definition of a decibel. Decibel, so the sound level, as measured in decibels, is 20, number 20, times log to the base 10 of PT over PR, where PT is the test pressure, or that's what you're interested in, the sound, if you will, and PR is a fixed number. That is the reference, that's the average among all of us. You don't want to count me, okay? So the average minimally audible sound, okay, for the human ear, that's PR. That's a reference pressure that it can hear, okay? Then you take the test sound and put it over the reference sound. You calculate a ratio, right? Very simple ratio. But then you take the log of that ratio to the base 10 and multiply it by 20. So a test sound, which is 100 times the reference pressure, okay, is going to be 100 over 1 is 100. Log to the base 10 of 100 is 2. 2 times 20 is 40. All right? So a sound with 100 times the pressure will have decibels of 40. Most of our conversational speech is around 65. And if you stand near a jet engine, it's about 120 decibels and it hurts. Okay? You get up to 120 decibels in a concert hall too, by the way. And you produce hearing loss when you do that. But however, so 120 decibels is a millionfold the reference pressure. Millionfold, okay? Remember, it's a log to the base 10, very non-linear scale. Now, the inner ear, this is both anatomy and physiology. It consists of the pinna, the concha, and the auditory meatus. And they serve to focus sound energy in a way that's going to be surprising. I'm going to explain in a minute, but it's really quite amazing. And they focus the sound energy on the tympanic membrane. So the ear is going to have to amplify all this very, very low energy, and it does it in lots of different ways. So this is the first way. The shape of the ear amplifies the sound. It produces a passive boost of 30 to 100 fold. That is, it itself, just the shape of the external ear, increases the sound coming in by 20 to 40 decibels. 20 would be 1, so that would be 10 to 100 times will be 20 to 40. When it's in the 3 kilohertz range, speech is speech is anywhere from 60 to 7,000. So 3 kilohertz is your typical speech range. 2 to 5,000 is standard voice. The external ear also filters the sound for elevation. So here's an experiment. You take a microphone and you put it on the tympanic membrane. Okay? Then you place the sound source in different places in relationship to the ear. Okay? Then, and you record it. Then you take the ear off. You take a different person in. So Maria, we put the microphone on Maria's ear. Then we bring Eli in and we say, Eli, put these headphones on. We give her nice Bose headphones and play the sound back that was recorded off Maria's tympanic membrane. And you say, hey, Eli, where do you think the sound was? And Eli goes, that one was up here. This one was down here. This one was over there. Okay? And the sound is coming in through a single source next to her ear, but it sounds different to her. And from that sound, which is shaped by the ear, she can tell the elevation of the sound, even when it's being played back from a recording. Okay? So the ear is doing a huge amount. Picture of the inner ear. This is the concha, this is the pinna. Okay? Here's your external auditory meatus. And we're going to get into this in a second. It's the tympanic membrane and all the other systems that you know, and I know that you know this. In the middle ear, sound is conducted to the tympanic membrane, right, by the pinna and the external auditory meatus that then vibrates. It sets in motion the hammer, the malleus in motion, and then to the incus, the anvil, and transmits the vibration to the stirrup or stapes. And then the stapes transmits that vibration to the oval window. This is, again, here's another source of amplification. You have a large tympanic membrane going down to the small oval window. In addition, the malleus, incus, and stapes are acting as a mechanical lever. And so you're over and over again, you're increasing and amplifying the pressure. Because that's what we're responding to, is the pressure that was created by the compression and rarefaction of the air is being amplified by the external ear and the entire middle ear as well. Okay. And again, I know that you know these, but here's your tympanic membrane. Here's the malleus, all right? Working the incus as a lever, and then using that lever to set those vibrations in motion. And remember, this is fast stuff. I'm doing like this at 3 hertz. Okay, we're talking 60 to 20,000 hertz, 20 to 30. Then we're going to get into the inner ear in a second, but you can see that the pressure, the vibrational pressure then, which is sent in through the oval window, is now going to travel all the way through this helicotrema, okay? And we'll look at that in some detail. The cochlea spirals, you know that, around the modiolus. Modiolus is the bony part of the tympanic membrane that forms the foundation for this spiral, all right? There are three compartments that we care about. There's the scala tympani, which is the outer one. You have an inner, which is, I was going to say vestibule, which is the scala vestibuli. Scala typically means room, right? Chamber, if you will. The Italian is for scala, is chamber, okay? And then the cochlear duct of the scala media, the middle, okay? So you have an outer, an inner, and middle. And the floor of the scala media is the basilar membrane. So then the pressure oscillations at the oval window are transmitted through this non-compressible fluid around the scala media to the round window, which relieves the pressure, okay, and sets the basilar membrane vibrating. And that's going to be our detection system. That's the organ of Corti is going to sit on the basilar membrane. All right. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the anatomy, but scala, you know, tympani, scala vestibuli, scala media, and the cochlea. All right. And so right now we're going to use this picture over and over, but here again, scala media, scala tympani, scala vestibuli, scala tympani, and the scala media here. And here you can see the organ of Corti, which is blown up. This is a cross section here of the cochlea, which is making 2.5 turns as a spiral. And now we've got to get into this whole complex structure of the organ of Corti. I like this picture too for the organ of Corti. I just put this up here so that you can, it's nicely labeled. It's a nice simple diagram and you can use it when you study on your own. I like this picture, not for its detail, but for its three-dimensional rendering. And it gives you a sense. It's very difficult to get a three-dimensional sense. Sometimes I have a gold inner ear that I bring. This is from my first chairman, Bob Moore's slide collection of slides of histology of everything in the body. This is from the inner ear. Okay, now we're really, okay, that's a sort of enough. Well, we've been doing a little bit of physiology, but now we need more physiology. So the question has to do with frequency. How do we determine pitch? All right, so let's deal with that. We begin with the notion that the basilar membrane, which is, remember, that's what's set in motion by all these vibrations. The basilar membrane is not uniform. It's narrow and stiff near the oval window, and it's wide and flexible at its apex. So that means narrow and stiff. That means it's going to take a lot of energy to make it vibrate close to the oval window. And where it's thin, wide, floppy, it's not going to take much energy at all to make it vibrate. Okay. Also, this characteristic will be that it not only will it take more energy to make it vibrate, it will vibrate fast because it's stiff. This is just going to flop. Okay. And so the resonance theory proposed that no longer, the resonance theory is an older theory of how we determine frequency of pitch. The resonance theory proposed that different frequencies caused a different piece of the basilar membrane to vibrate. And that's not true. That is not correct. As originally proposed, the resonance theory is not correct. It's much more interesting than that. Direct observations of the basilar membrane reveal that sound initiates a traveling wave, and it's just like a traveling wave, meaning like when you snap a whip, okay, and that wave just goes down to the tip. So that's what goes on. But the peak amplitude of vibration of that basilar membrane occurs. That's what determines the frequency that you detect. It's not that only that part vibrates. It's not the only part that oscillates. The whole thing vibrates with the wave, all right? But the peak of the amplitude, that's where the sound is detected. All right? So here you go. This is, we've straightened out the cochlea. It's not spiraling around right now. Here's the oval window. This will be the basilar, which is at the basilar membrane at its thickest and stiffest, and this will be at its floppiest. And so this area is going to be, see, here's one. This is 16 hertz, all right, 1600 hertz. This is 25 hertz down here, all right. So the further you get away from the oval window, the lower the frequency that is detected. It becomes the maximum amplitude. And this is a good diagram showing you that traveling wave that's going to go all the way down. Wherever it hits its maximum amplitude, that's going to be how we estimate the frequency of the sound that we heard. This I like because you're looking down on the basilar membrane and you can see that this is the narrow, this is what we mean when I say narrow and stiff. This thing is a block. I mean, it's almost a rectangle like this, as opposed to at this end, it's a flat sheet, okay? And same thing. All right, just because the basilar membrane does that, of course, that's not useful to us. We need neural signals, right? We need electrical signals here to know what this means. So it's the organ of Corti then which transduces the sensory information from vibrational energy into electrical signal. So, all right, the organ of Corti sits on the basement membrane in the scala media, all right, and of course is stimulated by the movement of the basement membrane. There are, in the organ of Corti, there are two classes of hair cells. There's what are called the inner cell layer and the outer cell layer. The outer cells, there's a triplet, okay? The single inner cell is just that, it's a single. These are the transducing cells. This triple layer is not transducing. The triple layer we'll come back to a little bit. The triple layer is an active system with its own motor system. Okay, so we're going to use this. The outer system is going to be to control the sensitivity of the basilar membrane, not just for loud sounds. Okay, the stapedius, right, will do that for us by dampening the ossicle system. Okay, not only that, but it will contribute to protecting the system from loud sound, but it also is much more sophisticated than that. Unlike the stapedius, which is just on or off, this thing can tune the basilar membrane by stiffening its relationship to the overlying tictorial membrane, and so it can make it much more selective for those hair cells that are there. So you say, yeah. I say that again. When I say, I do that all the time, and I say that again, but now I have a sense of where your frequency was. My ear has a sense of where your frequency was. I want to maximize my sensitivity to the frequency of your voice, because I say that again, I want to catch it. So I'm going to dampen almost everything else, but I'm going to enhance your frequency range. So now that's selective to my ear. That's how I do it. So this is a very, very, very sophisticated system, but this is the transducing system, not this. Then, so the tectorial membrane sits over these in contact with the cilia of the hair cells, all right? And as it moves, there's a shear force between them. So the basilar membrane moves, so here you go. So here's the tectorial membrane, here's the basilar membrane, right? As the basilar membrane vibrates and the tectorial membrane does not, these guys develop a shearing forces, which is diagrammed here, okay? Toward or away, we'll get to toward and away in a minute, all right? But this is the basis of the transduction. And this is part of the auditory nerve, and these are going to be afferents. This is also part of the auditory nerve, but these are efferents, okay? That's our brain, cochlear nucleus, tuning our hair cells, okay, to what we're interested in listening to. Lovely, lovely picture. Outer hair cell, the trio layer, inner hair cell. Okay, lovely. Beautiful. Man. I have a bunch of pictures. You know how I like pictures. These remind me of the Chinese, that underground Chinese tomb that was found where all the soldiers were lined up. But anyway, that's just one triplet of an outer hair cell. Now there is so if we look at the inner hair cell for a minute, and we have the cilia coming off the tip of the inner hair cell, There is one unique cilium called the kinocilium, all right? Much more complicated. Typical ciliary structure, same thing like you would find in, flagellated protists, all right? And in addition, these various cilia are connected to one another. They're not just floating loose, they're all connected. This is called a tip link. And I'm going to show you that. I think in the next is a much better picture. Look at this. This is gorgeous. This is beautiful. I think this is just gorgeous. So these are cilia of a single hair cell. They are all connected to one another in multiple ways, not only with the tip link, but with other desmosomal-like structures. All right. This is physiology, not histology. All right, so let's look at the resting membrane potential of the hair cell, which is our transducer cell. All right, it sits, resting membrane potential of a neuron, minus 65 to minus 70, right? This is a little bit depolarized compared to that, all right? The minus 45 to minus 60. Actually turns out that it's on purpose that it's sitting in an intermediate range like this. And so with this resting depolarization, there is associated arrestium calcium influx and a continuous neurotransmitter release. But this is not like the dark current of the retina, okay? Remember, the retina was maximally active, maximum calcium influx, maximum neurotransmitter release in the dark. That's not true in the ear. The ear is set at rest. The ear is in an intermediate state. It is always ready for up and down. Remember, it's compression and rarefaction. It's a vibration. It has to go and come, and it's going to be doing this. So its resting state is in the middle, all right? And there's some really peculiar things about this. Now, you deflect the hair cell relative to the kinocilium. So everything is either toward the kinocilium or away from the kinocilium. And when you deflect toward the kinocilium, you increase potassium entry and you depolarize the cell. And when you deflect away from the kinocilium, you increase potassium influx, but hyperpolarize the cell. And you're going, no, okay, no, okay. The answer is that there are two different potassium systems in the hair cell, okay? There's an apical and a basal system. In both cases, though, you're going to increase potassium and either hyperpolarize or depolarize the cell, which is very peculiar, I got to tell you, very peculiar. Same cell. Now, you have calcium entry and neurotransmitter release can increase with depolarization or decrease with hyperpolarization. So it's always ready to oscillate. That's what's really nice about it. And so it can generate a sinusoidal receptor potential up to 3 kilohertz. So up to 3,000 vibrations per second, oscillations per second, the system actually keeps pace with the sound. All right. Above that, 3,000 is going to be a dividing line, okay, for many things now. Now we're going to see this play out in lots of different ways. Below 3,000 kilohertz, the ear can keep up with the vibrations of the sound. Above 3 kilohertz, it cannot. Okay. The transducing inner hair cell never generates action potentials, okay? So it can release more neurotransmitter, the more neurotransmitter is glutamate. It can release more or it can release less, okay? But it never generates an action potential. Good diagram. This is a really good diagram. And here's an example of moving so away from the kinocilium, hyperpolarizing the cell, closing the calcium channels at the apex, and no transmitter is released. And here are the basal ones that are going to be also. And here's the system deflecting toward the kinocilium, okay? Pulling the channels open, those little tip links are in this cartoon are inducing conformational changes in the potassium receptor, opening them, allowing the potassium in, which depolarizes the cell, releasing the neurotransmitter. Okay, and this is again, this is an example of it keeping pace with the oscillations until you get over 3,000, at which point the thing just saturates. All right, so it can't oscillate above that. So this is peculiar with the potassium influx, so we need to look at that in a little bit more detail. that, and we say it up front so you get it, it can do both. How does it do that? Well, the endolymph, so take the endolymph is in the scala media. So that's called the endolymph. The middle one is the inside one. So the endolymph is in the scala media. That has a very high potassium content. The perilymph in the scala tympani or vestibule is almost no potassium at all, very, very low. So the inner hair cell is actually sitting between a high potassium bath and a zero potassium bath. That's what's going on. And that's why you can use the potassium, not sodium, interestingly, right? I mean, this is sort of interesting. It doesn't use sodium or chloride, but it does still use calcium. It does still use calcium. But the calcium, the polarization of the cell by an ingoing potassium current, this is distinctly unusual. All right. And we've already said, so this is basically what we're saying. And now we see it. And here this diagram's nice because you want to keep it straight. This diagram really helps. In the endolymph, you have a high potassium soup, and in the outer, in the scala tympani and scala vestibule, a very low perilymph, right? And the inner hair cell sitting at an intermediate state. Really a nice system, actually. We already said that the hair cells are finely tuned. Now we're still now back to the question of how do we detect pitch, right? Frequency, pitch, that sort of thing. So so we already said, first of all, that the outer ear is already capable of shaping, and the basilar membrane certainly is capable of shaping pitch as it gets to the transducers, but so are the transducers themselves. The actual stiffness of the cilia, allow the cell to tune to a certain pitch. Remember, higher energy, higher frequency, higher energy. Higher energy, you want a system that's very stiff, okay? Low energy, low frequency, you want a system that's very soft, okay? So the basilar membrane is hard to soft. The cilia that are in the inner hair cells also are hard to soft. It's not just the basilar membrane. The cilia that are up there are stiffer or more pliant, and they therefore contribute to the exquisite tuning, because we have from this, I mean, the whole, if you put the cochlea and unwrapped it, it would maybe be that long, and you're going from 20,000 hertz to 20 hertz. That's a lot of discrimination, okay? I mean, that's a lot of frequencies in this 1 inch long thing, okay? So you better be finely tuned. So we're going to do that lots of different ways. Basilar membrane, inner hair cell. And that's what they're saying in their electromechanical properties. They are tonotopic. That's the word that's used there. Tonotopic because each hair cell is tuned to a different frequency. All right. The other one that you can use is you can also use the outer hair cells, which, as we say, will further tune the whole cell as well as the basilar membrane. We talked about the 3 kilohertz threshold. Below, we said it follows below 3 kilohertz, it cannot above. So you could take, let's say that you have a 1 kilohertz, all right? And you have one ear is hearing that 1 kilohertz, the other ear is hearing the 1 kilohertz. They both are following, okay? All the oscillations, the electrical oscillations. Where did I just have that? Where was the diagram that we just had? Here, this one. So it's doing like this, right? The whole system is doing like that. The electrical signal is going up and down at 1,000 kilohertz, right? So now, if one gets the sound before the other, then it starts to look like this, and I start to be able to detect the phase difference between the two. So as long as it's oscillating in sync with the vibrations, all right, I can compare the two electromechanical oscillations and look for a phase difference between the cells. Once I get up here, where I'm not keeping pace with the oscillations, then there's no phase difference anymore. And what the system will do is turn to amplitude of the sound for localization in space, because it loses phase. Phase is extremely sensitive, phase contrast microscopy, that sort of thing. If you can measure phase, you can see unbelievable. When you shift like this, you can see so clearly. Amplitude is frankly harder. All right. All right. So that's what we're saying. And this is, I like this diagram. It's a complex diagram. This is from your book. You really sort of need the legend to follow this diagram. This is sort of a test. This is a threshold, if you will, for causing the transducer cell, the inner hair cell, to fire. It doesn't fire action potential, but to depolarize. And this is just showing you how this electrical sensitivity, now we're talking electrical rather than mechanical, how the electrical sensitivity varies according to the sound frequency. The other thing that I thought was really cool is that you have this, this is a nice piece of the diagram, where you see that the maximum firing, this is actually firing, and these are spikes now in the auditory nerve. All right, so we haven't talked about the auditory nerve yet, but these are the spikes that are firing, and sorry. All right, and you see that the spikes occur on the rising phase of the oscillation, and then they die out pretty quickly. This is still above background by the time this is back down to zero. And the other thing is it decays really fast. So here I mean, remember, you could be talking 1,000 hertz, all right? And this thing is decayed in 20 cycles, all right? So it's really tuned to it's much more sensitive at the beginning of the sound than it is. So again, if you think of me, and someone starts to talk to me, by the time I turn to them, my system is down-regulated. It's not to my advantage. So if you go, catch my attention, and then I'm listening, all right, then I'm going to hear it because I know from the beginning what you're saying. That's why I go, if you say it again, I'll hear it. But the first time, it's like, I just have presbycusis. It's just normal. But, you know, if I'm not listening to you at the start and you start talking and I go, and my system is no longer at its maximum capability. So just go. Okay, spiral ganglion and auditory nerve. So the neurons in the spiral ganglion, now finally, right, so far we've only been at the transducer level. So now the transducer cell, we had a diagram a while ago that showed the transducer cell, and you saw that it makes a synaptic contact. The transducer cell was not firing action potentials, but the bipolar neuron is going to fire action. Okay. Neurons in the spiral ganglion, you'll see it, it's really pretty. There are bipolar neurons. The peripheral portion, that way, is activated by glutamate release from the inner hair cell. And then the central portion is the auditory nerve. It's heading to the brainstem. There are, get this, only 33,000 spiral ganglion neurons in the whole auditory nerve. 33,000, not million, not 33,000. There are only 3,000 inner hair cells altogether. All right, in each ear. All right, for sound detection. So there's obviously a 10-to-1 ratio. So roughly speaking, that is 10 neurons innervate a single inner hair cell, and they are pretty faithful. They're pretty monogamous. You don't have a lot of neurons interacting with more than one hair cell. All right. The fibers then from the central nervous system go ahead and innervate the outer hair cells so that we can get tuning, as we talked about. And this was the diagram that I was talking about here. No, it wasn't. But at any rate, here come so this is the afferents, and the green are the efferents. You saw that, but now you have a better understanding of that. I like this diagram. Here are the cell bodies of the bipolar neurons. This is roughly where the cell bodies are in the spiral ganglion, not in the cochlear ganglion. This is not called the cochlear ganglion, okay? That is at the brainstem. Cochlear nucleus is in the brainstem. The ganglion of the bipolar cells following the modulus, right, is known as the spiral ganglion, okay? Because this is just a cross section, this is occurring 2.5 turns. So again, the spiral ganglion, all right, here, this is the spiral ganglion. Here they are. And they just follow, see them? There they are. And those are the cell bodies sort of obscured. So that's the way they are. And it's almost like a twisted cable. The auditory nerves are a twisted cable that then cut out, and that's the cochlear nerve. Or auditory nerve. All right. This is the showing, remember, all of this coming from the scala media, so it actually has to pierce the cochlea in order to get out. And this is a nice diagram from the cut section view, like that red picture that I showed you from Bob Morissette here, like that. Okay, and this is what it looks like, and here's the cochlear nerve, and here are the cells of the spiral ganglion here, and here, and here. Like this. Here's your spiral ganglion. This is as if the bone and all of the non-neural structures were removed. This is what it would look like. Beautiful.
You saw a beautiful picture of the spiral ganglion last year, like
yeah. It's
What is the benefit of having this spiral process in the cochlea in terms of auditory conduction?
I don't know. It's embedded in the temporal bone, and I guess it something about that. I really don't know. I don't know. At any rate, there it goes, and it's heading now to the brainstem. All right. So let's talk. We're doing physiology, not anatomy. So let's talk about localization in space. One of my favorite topics, actually. I'll give you a story that was a fun story. We were 5 neurologists. You get 5 neurologists. The story was 5 neurologists. 5 neurologists were walking in the Anza Borrega desert. Okay, we were at a meeting. We took the afternoon off, and we decided we would walk in the desert, which we did, and it was gorgeous. That's in Southern California, outside San Diego. And at that moment, I was the last person. Okay, so everybody was ahead. They startled a chameleon gecko type of creature, okay, a reptile of some sort. And what it did was it turned, so nobody else saw it but me, okay, because they were all lateral to it, okay, and I was behind. And I saw this whole event take place. The reptile turned and bit its tail off, okay? The tail began to shake like a rattle. It ran, okay? Everybody, soundlessly, okay? 4 neurologists turned and watched this rattle. And it was beautiful. You talk about a defense mechanism, okay? But what was really interesting was that you had these 4 neurologists in a row. And when they turned, when the rattle started, and they, of course, scared the dickens out of them, okay? And when they turned to see what it was, if you took a vector from their eyes to where the rattle was, the vectors would have crossed where the rattle was. All of them, in a fraction of a second, maybe 300 milliseconds, had turned their head and eyes to look at the rattle in perfection. They were perfectly on target. So I didn't know if I was more interested in the reptiles or the other neurologists who had done this. But my point is that localization in space is unbelievable. We can reproduce this experiment. I can walk in the room and I just quietly walk around and tell you to close your eyes and clap my hands and say, point where, eyes closed, point where I clap. And when you do that, everybody's pointing at where my hands go. Okay, everybody, right from around the room. Okay, so it's an amazing ability. And you don't do like this. You go, where was that sound? Okay, that's not what you do. You go, what was that? Like this. Okay, that's the way it works. The system is unbelievable. Now, it works in 2 different ways depending on if you're above or below 3 kilohertz. Okay, 3 kilohertz you can follow, you can use phase. Over 3,000 you lose that mechanism, so you use the amplitude. There's another problem with using phase, and that is above 3 kilohertz, the head becomes a barrier to sound. Okay, below 3 kilohertz, it's not. So you oscillate below the barrier and use phase. Above the barrier, you make use of the fact that it's a barrier and let amplitude determine it, because your head's going to reduce the amplitude of the sound which has to cross the head. That will not be true below 3 kilohertz. So the system totally matches your head, okay? The physics of your skull. It's really an amazing system, okay? In both cases, you require binaural, okay? In neither case can you localize with a single ear, okay? You have to have binaural representation, therefore, which is why there are no central nervous system causes of unilateral hearing loss. Okay, that's a firm rule for localization. If the person loses hearing in one ear, it's peripheral. It's not central, because the central nervous system from the brainstem on in is binaural, and that's the way it is. Okay, so the ventral cochlear, now we're going to look at ventral and dorsal cochlear nucleus. And we're going to let the sound, we have two different problems now. We have localization and we have identification. It's just like with the eye, right? We've got to be able to do motion and we've got to figure out what we're looking at. Those two systems are going to separate now in the ear, right at the brainstem, okay? Right as it comes in the cochlear nucleus. The ventral portion of the cochlear nucleus will begin a series of relays which are about localization. The dorsal cochlear nucleus will begin a series of relays which are maintained faithfully for identification of the sound. Okay, so two different systems from now on. It's going to be more than two, but we're going to satisfy ourselves with two. The ventral cochlear nucleus then projects to the bilateral superior olivary complex. So that's the first, you have the cochlear nucleus, and then they have the superior olivary complex, bunch of nuclei in there, and they cross via the trapezoid body. All right. The medial portion of the superior cochlear olivary complex, okay, are sensitive to the low frequency sounds. The lateral portion of the superior olivary complex, high frequency sounds. Okay, so that's a divergence. So as I said, we're going to do ventral for localization, we're going to do dorsal for identification, but even in the ventral system, we got two different mechanisms that are localizing, so we have two different sets of neurons. The medial neurons are below 3 kilohertz, the lateral are above 3 kilohertz. The brain's no fool, okay? It makes use of the information coming in. I don't know that I really care for this diagram very much, honestly. It just shows you that the way that the olivary complex is arranged, so here, the sound is closer to the left ear, okay, but it has a longer path. I don't know, forget it. I don't like that. And we also have this is the nucleus, medial nucleus of the trapezoid body, which also is going to contribute to that and put some, this is going to be for the system which is based above 3 kilohertz. And you can see that what happens is here's your two ears, left ear, right ear. This is the firing rate coming through the auditory nerve for left ear, right ear. You take this 70 decibel sound driver and you just start it at the left ear and bring it around and bring it around to the right ear. And this is the firing rates in the auditory nuclei. And they basically fall off. Actually, so this is the firing rate here in the medial nucleus of the trapezoid body. And you can see that when you have the sound over by the left ear, it's responding on the left side. And when you have it on the right side, and in the middle, it's actually not responding at all. Because one is inhibiting the other. That's the point, is the far away sound is inhibiting the near sound. And when they're equal, then the balance is such and there's no firing at all. It's in the midline. This is for localization, not for identification. The sound is still coming in. The brain is still sensing it. This is just a localizing mechanism. This is the first time this diagram will appear. And it's too small, but you'll be able to see it when you're on your own computer. And it's a good diagram so that it shows the divergence of the ventral cochlear nucleus and the dorsal cochlear nucleus and how one ends up at the different way stations that are for localization, which we're going to go over in a minute. And the other one just passes right on to higher centers. The dorsal cochlear will go straight up to the inferior colliculus, and that's where it's going to be for identification of sound, but we'll look at that in more detail. We don't have much longer to go. We'll finish in 5 minutes. The dorsal cochlear nucleus then projects, as I said, directly to the inferior colliculus. So we want to follow these two systems all the way up to cortex is what we want to do, and then we're done. The dorsal cochlear nucleus is for perception of sound quality, including both pitch and loudness. So everything that we know, this is a trumpet, okay? This is Annie, okay? That sort of thing is going to be determined by the system that comes in to the dorsal cochlear nucleus, inferior olivary complex, up to the medial geniculate, up to the cortex. Okay, localization stops much lower down. It's shared in the trapezoid body. It's shared at, levels of the, there's a second nucleus, so those lateral lemniscus nucleus. Okay, the portions that are for sound quality don't have this cascade, don't have as many steps. Same diagram. The inferior colliculus then is going to, it has to deal with both localization parameters coming up the ventral nucleus and the trapezoid body nuclei and that sort of thing. But it also has to deal with the dorsal cochlear nucleus information. It gives much more, at this level, there is much more, far more neurons, much larger portion of the nucleus is devoted to the identification of sound. All right, localization has already been done. It's been tested. It's going to pass along. It was this year, okay? This year more than that year. Relative distance, that's already occurred in the lower brain stem. So what's coming up is mainly for identification of sound. And this is known as the lemniscal pathway. This is the lateral lemniscus, okay? You also have the extralemniscal, which are the portions that were for localization, all right? So when we say inferior colliculus, we're really focused on the central nucleus. The central nucleus is the main portion for identification of the qualities of sound. It is, as I said, precisely tonotopic. It knows the frequency of the sound. The extralemniscal pathway no longer cares about frequency. Once it's figured out the localization, it really doesn't matter what the frequency was or even how loud it was. It just wants to know where it was. Okay, different system altogether for what was the sound. Okay, all right, and it's not tonotopic. It loses all of that information. It doesn't need it. It's already heavily processed information. This is a much more faithful rendition of what the sound really was. Right? And then same thing, the inferior colliculus projects up to the medial geniculate, and the medial geniculate also has, if you talk about medial geniculate, you're really saying the ventral division of the medial geniculate. We don't even bother saying it. We just say medial geniculate, and by that we mean the portion that is coming up from the inferior colliculus and on its way to cortex. It's understood. There are other divisions. I'm not going to name them. They are for localization. They're small. They're not doing much work, okay? They're just passing the information along, and they're receiving they're starting to compare. So, okay, you say it was localized there. Show me, then let me see it, okay? Let me, right, the damn mosquito, right? I heard it go over there. Yeah, son of a gun, right? So where you mix your visual and somatotopic information with your localization. Up to the auditory cortex. So the auditory cortex, the primary receptive area of auditory cortex is area 41, frequently referred to as Heschel's gyrus. Okay, and that's the equivalent of the calcarine lips, right, of area 17. That's the equivalent of the post-central gyrus, 312. This is going to be a type 5 Brodmann's cortex, all granular cells receiving information, projecting very little. Okay, that's going to be area 41 that is on the dorsal surface of the temporal lobe, typical primary. It receives the core projection from the ventral medial geniculate body, which was from the central inferior colliculus. So this is where it's all going. Okay, it actually has two completely different maps. No one has any idea why at the present time. All right, and it has, just like you have different visual columns, you have isofrequency columns that are there in Heschel's gyrus. So here's Heschel's gyrus. Here's its tonotopic map, looking down on the temporal lobe. So this is a funny diagram, but basically you cut off this portion of the brain to expose this. Here's Heschel's gyrus, and here are secondary speech areas. Notice that they call this Wernicke's area, and we've had discussions as to whether Wernicke's area is here or the whole thing. There's no agreement on what Wernicke's area actually is. In the auditory cortex, you then have all this medial geniculate sent it to 41, 41 sent it to 42, and 22, which is Wernicke's area, whatever that means. And there are so distinct auditory fields Nobody knows why. This one we know why. It's for speech. Okay, that sort of thing. But there are other things, probably for music, probably for who knows what, identification of food of various types. This is a chicken, this is, I mean, right, you have portions of the brain which are for facial recognition. Wouldn't you have portions that are responsible for, again, not only word recognition, but voice recognition? I can hear, who is it that called? Eli. So Eli called me last night on the phone, and even through the phone system, it was like, I knew it was Eli. Okay, I mean, I could just hear it, right? And it wasn't even, you say it was my accent. It wasn't even her accent. It wasn't the accent at all. There was a frequency range. I know there's a shape to the frequency range of Elec's voice. I'm aware of that. I love music.
But the memory
Oh, sure, I have to connect it and go, this pattern. Oh, I mean, I'm not going to say how I think about Maria's voice, but Maria's voice is very distinctive aside from her accent. Forget her accent, okay? If you all just said ah, I could probably tell you which one was which, just from hearing you say ah, okay? It's just your sound, your voice sounds are structured in a pattern of frequency distribution, which is easily identifiable. And I'm not saying me, I'm saying that's how our brain is structured. So there must be a region that is responsible for that. That's not using my CPU to figure that out each time the sound comes in. I knew it was ELEC in way under a second, right? So there's a subsystem, there's a small circuit who's doing nothing but identifying people's voices. I mean, that's got to be true. If you stimulate area 41, you get whistles, bells, and cricket sounds and that sort of thing if you stimulate this area. But if you stimulate outside area 41, Penfield and Jasper in a phenomenal book written in '54 in which they were doing, Jasper was a neurologist, they were at the Montreal Neurologic. Jasper was a neurologist who was examining every patient that Penfield was doing epilepsy surgery on awake. And Penfield was stimulating them with the single cell stimulators, and Penfield was recording what the patient did or said. And there was one I'll never forget, and Jasper's listening to this lady who's being stimulated posteriorly to Heschel's gyrus, and she goes, and they're just stimulating her with a brief pulse of electricity, and she goes, oh, she said, I remember that concert. She said, we were in the Alberts Hall. She said, God, Beethoven's Fifth. I remember I was sitting with, and starts just describing the whole who she was with, and it was just like that. And in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, there's a similar passage where I forget the protagonist, but she's sitting, not Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, in Virginia Woolf's, in one of her novels. There's a similar recollection that a woman has in a symphony hall, actually, and she's just describing everything of how her gloves were laid on her lap when something happened. Okay, there's your memory. All right, finally, there are neurons which are much more complicated, where they don't respond to one frequency, they respond to combinations of frequencies. You have to have the right combination. This one has to be at this, and this one has to be at this, or it won't fire. But when you fire, and if you do one and not the other, they won't fire. But when you do the two of them together, they fire. Okay, so it gets much, much more complicated. And as I say, this is for determination of vocalization. The bats do the same thing with echolocation. And then certain neurons now we're up in the cortex and secondary auditory cortices are responsible for temporal sequences. They'll think about a bird. Okay, if you've ever listened to mating calls of birds, or in Virginia, there were some mockingbirds. I used to go between buildings and there was a couple mockingbirds, and you could sit down and listen. The mockingbird never repeats its song. It's infinitely variable. It's amazing. But I always picture the female listening to the male's song, okay? And she's listening for a pattern, right? And when she hears the right pattern, she's going to mate, okay? And that's a lovely thing among the birds, really. So, I don't want to say we have the same thing, but we do hear temporal sequences. And interestingly, the temporal sequences go in one direction. The same, you can reverse the sequence and the neuron goes, not even close, and won't fire at all. Okay, so there's just a lot. This is listening to music in the PET scanner. If you, the question is always, do you hear on the right side or the left side, that sort of thing. If you, so put a person in a PET scanner, play a pure tone, okay, right side. Play a chord, right side, okay. Play a Bach fugue, all right, you know, it depends on the person. If they are musically naive, they hear it on the right side. If they're a musician, they hear it on the left side. They're hearing, it's a language, a syntactical language, and as soon as you do the fugue to a musician, it's over on the left side. The right side will still light up, but the left side lights up. Left side doesn't light. If you're musically naive and go, oh, cool, you know, like that, okay? Right side. There you go. All right. He's been waiting for this talk all along. The auditory system is amazing. It's just simply amazing. Okay, it's of all the neural systems that there are, I think the auditory is the most amazing one.
Have you seen patients with stroke that in the pathway that they can hear but they couldn't vocalize?
No, because they honestly they end up with a unilateral hearing loss or a brainstem stroke. And no, but I had several musicians. Sort of unfortunate. They're among the saddest patients that I had. I had a patient who, I didn't know it at the time, but he was one of the best accordion players in the world. I mean, he was, you know, many records as an accordion player. And he had a relatively